Today's episode is brought to you by Charles Russell Speechleys. Charles Russell Speechleys is an international law firm with a special focus on private capital at the intersection of personal, family and business interests. With origins dating back to the 1800s, the firm has a long-standing reputation for building strong, trusted relationships with their clients. These relationships are crafted to deliver meaningful value and, like Charles Russell Speechleys, are designed to stand the test of time. In a world that is constantly changing, the steadfast, long-term relationships that Charles Russell Speechleys builds with their clients remains a constant. To learn more about their services and how they can help you, please visit www.charlesrussellspeechleys.com. Hello, I'm Violet Manners and welcome to Hidden Heritage, the podcast that brings you inside Great Britain's favourite destinations, with help from custodians, historians, artisans and experts. This week on the podcast, I speak with Kate Ballenger, the Keeper of Collections for Blenheim Palace. Kate is the current Head of Collections for Blenheim. In her role, Kate is responsible for the management, development and preservation of all collections for Blenheim Palace. In today's conversation, Kate gives us an insight into the incredible history of Blenheim Palace and what the collection comprises of. We discuss the challenges around protecting Blenheim that she encounters as the Keeper of Collections. And Kate takes us through the exciting seasonal events happening all year round. I also ask Kate what she sees in the future for Blenheim. But before all that, let's welcome our guest. Thank you so much for joining us, Kate. Can you just tell us a little bit more about your role at Blenheim and your title and what you do there day to day?
My role at Blenheim is Keeper of Palace and Collections, and that involves not only looking after the care and conservation of the palace and collection, it also involves planning exhibitions, managing filming on site. I look after the archives, a cleaning team, a maintenance team, and a collections team.
Wow. And just tell us a little bit about Blenheim Palace. Where is it in the country? And could you describe it a little bit, the history of its architecture and landscape and gardens?
The palace is situated just outside of Oxford, right by the village of Woodstock. And it is an English, they say one of the best examples of English Baroque. Architect was Sir John Vanbrugh with Nicholas Hawksmoor. And it was originally royal land, a hunting ground for Henry I. He put a wall around the entirety of the park. And then the land was given to the first Duke of Marlborough by Queen Anne after his victory in the Wars of Spanish Succession.
I see. And Blenheim Palace has got such a fascinating and storied history. Could you just give our listeners a little bit of a sort of idea of its plotted history a little bit? And let's maybe start why, you've explained why it was built and how, but any of the sort of notable figures in its history more recently, or your favourites that stand out?
So we'll start at the beginning, because one of the first one would definitely be the first Duchess of Marlborough, Sarah. She was a formidable woman. It's well known she was very close with Queen Anne and was one of her advisors, essentially. And while her husband was away fighting the wars in Europe, she was the one managing the build at Blenheim single-handedly. All of the architect, the tradesman, the craftsman, it was all down to Sarah, because John was just, the first Duke was never there.
It's a huge responsibility.
Absolutely.
And then in the early 1900s, you have Consuelo Vanderbilt, American money, swoop into Blenheim. Will you just tell us a little bit about her? Because I think Consuelo Vanderbilt is such an iconic, the Vanderbilts are such an iconic American family. And it's fascinating, how, that huge American family married into arguably one of the most famous British aristocratic families. We'd love to know a bit more about her from you.
So that's something that started happening in the early 1900s. There were a number of aristocrats in England that looked to American heiresses, the dollar princesses, to bring their fortunes to come over and save, essentially, these beautiful old buildings that had fallen into a state of disrepair. As you know, these places take a lot to maintain. A lot to maintain. So Consuelo sadly wasn't keen on marrying the ninth Duke. She was in love with someone else, as was he, and was said to have cried going down the aisle. But in the end, she came to Blenheim. She made a huge mark on it. She did her duty and provided, as she said, the heir and the spare. And then they later divorced, and she went on to marry very, very happily later in life.
Wow. And obviously, speaking of notable figures in relation to Blenheim, we can't skip over the late Prime Minister, Sir Winston Churchill, who was, as happy accident being born at Blenheim. But would you just tell us a little bit about how did Sir Winston Churchill end up being born at Blenheim?
So Winston was the grandson of the 7th Duke and Duchess of Marlborough.
Okay.
His parents were there for a ball. The story goes that early labour was brought on by a rough carriage ride throughout the day. And when they realised that his mother, Jenny Jerome, was in labour, they went to a very small room in the palace, which was being used as a cloakroom, and they cleared all of the coats off the bed, brought in some water, and his mother gave birth to Winston there. They had to go to Woodstock to get a local doctor because the doctor from London couldn't be there, and they borrowed a tiny little baby vest to dress him in from one of the local women in the village, and we still have that in our collection, which is amazing.
Gosh. Because at Blenheim you can still go and see Winston's, there's a suite, isn't there?
Yes, you can go into the room that he was born.
Wow, amazing. And there are so many fascinating stories about Blenheim, but most especially given your role as the keeper of collections at Blenheim, it'd be really interesting to more specifically hear about of how the collection at Blenheim came to be, really.
So obviously it has a mixed history.
Yeah.
This is the first Duke and Duchess acquired quite a few pieces, but then through succession, say that the third Duke acquired the Sunderland Library, which was considered one of the best collections in Europe of over 20,000 books. But then the Marlborough Gems with the fourth Duke, and they were again considered one of the more important collections in Europe. But sadly, the needs of the house and the family took up most of those things, and they were sold at auction by various dukes. So it's a much reduced collection over the years. There was a huge sale in 1886 where sadly all of the wonderful treasures which I so wish were still there, such as the Titians and the Rembrandts, and were all sold off at that time.
All great artists of their day.
Yes,
absolutely.
And the collection was very much focused around being a family portraits and more the family history.
Right. And so I guess, that slightly touches on, the fact that there are sort of challenging points in Blenheim's history in preserving it. When was the most sort of challenging moment for Blenheim's history in terms, like when were they sort of selling off the majority of the collection or having to really kind of buckle down, I guess? Well,
1886 was probably the most challenging, where they sold all of the treasures and that brought the most amount of money in. But then there's always has been times where it's been in jeopardy, and hence the reason the palace was open to the public in the 1950s. The roof was leaking and things were in a terrible state of disrepair, and the only way to raise the funds to be able to fix these things was to open to the public, and that's still true today. All of our visitor money goes straight back into the conservation and restoration of the building and the estate.
Yeah, which is a huge, I mean, for anyone that hasn't seen Blenheim, it really is staggering when you're sort of standing in front of it at those gates and looking at it. I mean, it's just mind-blowing how enormous the place really is. So Kate, what is Blenheim's historic sort of significance to the UK, would you say, in your own words?
I would say, it is a site of national importance. We are the only non-royal palace in existence, and it's also in the 80s we were designated a World Heritage Site. We're a site of scientific interest. We have species of rare bees, rare bats, as well as this amazing building and collection. I mean, the whole package, it is obviously, that's why it's so important to protect a place like this, so then it can be enjoyed by so many more generations.
I agree. So let's just talk about Blenheim's wider role historically and within its local community. The walls kind of are, parallel to Woodstock, which is a gorgeous Oxfordshire town. But what is Blenheim's sort of role historically within its community and also today in its kind of present day?
So as you said, it does butt right up against the village. And traditionally Woodstock was a village that made gloves for the royal family.
I didn't know that.
Yes,
that's
all
really
of the
cool.
glove makers were based there. Blenheim is surrounded by 3 villages, and as part of that has always been a huge part of each village's life. We still do that now. We try and be as involved in the community as much as possible because they are part of us as well. Traditionally, servants or many people from the villages would come and work in the estates.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then today it's a very similar, but different in that people that I know, having been to Blenheim a few times, you can see the sort of local, the locals coming in for their daily walks in the park. And you've come up with brilliant initiatives to sort of get the local people, I think there's a membership that you can have when you're local.
Yes, you can get a walking pass to walk in the estate whenever you like.
Yeah.
And we've also just built a community path from the village of Longhambra the whole way through the estate where people can cycle or walk.
Wow. It's amazing. So really, it's kind of ever evolving. Its role is ever evolving in its local community. That's so cool. It's it's fascinating. I mean, there's so much sort of history to Blenheim, but I think it's really interesting to give our listeners a kind of context of Blenheim's past. But to your point earlier, these places are very much still living and breathing destinations, family homes, and in Blenheim's case, uniquely, a national heritage site. It'd be really cool now to move on to talking about the present day and the role that you play in its ever evolving kind of collection and development and maintenance of it. So what are the kind of objects and things in Blenheim's collection still today that you love? I mean, you said the Marlborough jewels were sold off. It'd be quite interesting for listeners to know what the Marlborough jewels really were.
They were essentially a collection of 800 very beautifully decorated cameos and brooches that were just considered amazing examples of craftsmanship at that time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then
we have the casts still.
You do?
Yes.
So
not all of them, but only a few.
So they were sold without their cast. Why would that have been? Why would that have happened?
I don't know, but we were very pleased when we found them hidden in a cupboard one day.
Really? And then what are the kind of objects that are in the collection now, still today, that people can actually see for themselves?
So it's a very broad collection, a lot of paintings and drawings, prints, but then a huge collection of china, silver, furniture, tapestries. We're so fortunate that the first Duke commissioned a set of tapestries after the Battle of Blenheim and all the succeeding battles, and each tapestry is a perfect historical record of each battle because they got portraits of everyone involved and gave them to the weaver. They're woven in Brussels, but we still have them intact, the whole collection, and in their place that they were originally designed for.
Wow. And what was the Battle of Blenheim?
So essentially, at that stage, the French and the rest of Europe.
We're talking sort of 1600s?
No, sort of late 1600s, early 1700s. Yeah, the Battle of Blenheim was in 1704 and then sort of a few other battles after that. So essentially winning that battle changed the face of Europe and the power structure in Europe. It's often said if that wasn't the case, then this would be a place where everyone spoke French.
Wow. And given your role as the keeper of collections at Blenheim, what are your favourite items within Blenheim's current collection today?
Oh, there's so many. But we have a beautiful George Stubbs painting of a tigress. It's actually called the Tiger, but she is a tigress, and she was owned by the 4th Duke of Marlborough and kept on the estate. She was given by Lord Clive of Bengal as a present. Wow. And we still have bills in the archives that every 3 days she was given 24 pounds of meat.
That's enormous.
Yes.
Oh my God.
Apparently, eventually she had to be moved on because she grew and grew and she became a little hard to handle. So she went back to India. Yes, but she had the most, it's such a beautiful painting. And because normally you see tigers obviously in action or being aggressive, but she's just lying very serenely on the ground.
In the palace or in the grounds of the palace?
It's in the, well, they say it was painted at the palace. He did 3 versions of it. Okay. And one of them was given to the Duke. It's hard to tell. The background's very sort of nondescript.
Okay.
Exactly where.
And Stubbs, for anyone that doesn't know, was who? And if you could describe him.
Well, essentially an English painter, but he did mainly known for his horse portraits.
Yeah.
But did many other animals as well.
Yeah, he's got that there's a very famous portrait by Stubbs in the National Gallery, which is one of my favourites of a horse rearing up. I mean, you said you've been in your role for 18 years, and it sounds like your role's really evolved over those 18 years. But as now the head of collections and keeper of collections, what are the sort of personal challenges that you face, sort of maintaining, the collection and keeping it intact in the 21st century?
One of the biggest challenges is obviously we need to bring in funds to maintain it. And that means making occasional not compromises, but we allow filming inside. We have events. We're open to the public 364 days a year. We have nearly 900,000 visitors a year.
Amazing.
And that brings challenges in itself, wear and tear, dust, all kinds of problems, so it's finding that balance to be able to do these things but still protect the heritage. The aim is always, with whatever we do, that when we finish doing it, the palace and the collection are unchanged.
Yes, and left, in as neat a condition as
Absolutely.
it was before.
And it is possible. It's challenging, but it is possible.
Yeah, for sure. Because as you say, sort of stately homes like this are often, they've gone from being, singularly family homes up until the kind of mid-1900s to evolving ultimately into businesses. They've had to, by virtue of, the changing of times and the need and necessity for them to survive and not only survive but thrive. And I think it's been really interesting. So, to host exhibitions and the redecoration that's sometimes required when a big film or blockbuster movie comes in, for which Blenheim has been in so many. I mean, James Bond movies, Napoleon most recently.
Yes, most recently.
But
Mission Impossible, Harry Potter.
It's mad.
Yes.
I mean, it really has. Once you've been to Blenheim, it's really easy to actually start spotting it in all these iconic films. Could you pick out some of your sort of favourite highlights throughout the year, or like favourite moments that you've had in your 18 years of creating exhibitions? And then we want to move on to the current exhibition. But it'd be really cool to know about any of your favourite projects that you've worked on in the last sort of few years at Blenheim.
Probably most of my favourite projects involve conservation.
Really?
Yes, absolutely, because it's so important but also so rewarding when the palace obviously is a 300-year-old building, so it has very challenging environmental conditions. And when I came, we didn't check any of those conditions, and we didn't have film or UV blinds, which obviously UV light is very damaging for collections. We had fluctuating humidity, temperature, all of the things that can really damage art and artefacts. So to be able to change the environment and get all of that under control, and then slowly work through conserving all of these items. So now they'll be hopefully stable for another 200-300 years and will require no intervention.
Yeah, which is amazing, because you really are leaving your mark, your legacy on.
That's always been my aim, to retire and know that everything is in a safe, stable condition.
Wow. That's an amazing thought. And also to think, it's interesting that you picked out Consuela and Sarah, the first Duchess, as the two that you really, that really sort of, I guess, of most personal interest to you, perhaps. And it's interesting, women have been so central to sort of Blenheim's history, and it still is today by the sounds of it.
Yes.
Yeah. And how can visitors get the most out of visiting Blenheim? I mean, you've been there for 18 years, you've worked there, you've obviously seen, as you said, Blenheim uniquely gets sort of almost 1 million people going around it a year. Are there any sort of tips and tricks as to how people can get the most out of their visit to Blenheim?
The first tip would be, we have you have the opportunity when you buy a ticket to buy a donation ticket. And that means, for our benefit, if it's gift aided, the gift aid comes back to us, and we're able to use that for conservation and restoration. But a donation ticket entitles you to an annual pass, which means you can come back as many times as you want within the 12 months. Because it really is too much to see in one day. I mean, you really need to focus either on the palace and exhibitions, or then you could spend all day wandering around the gardens, and then the park goes for miles. We have some of the oldest oaks, 1,000-year-old oaks in the park. So, there's so many amazing things. Our lake is just gorgeous, and we just spent 2 years dredging that.
Really?
We had to, for environmental reasons. A huge, obviously, very expensive project.
Hugely expensive. Just explain, because dredging is what? It's basically bringing the sort of peat and the sort of...
The silt
that's
had
built
all
up.
gathered. And we had a huge layer of silt underneath that was just blocking it up. We initially thought we'd have to do a dry dredge, but we did a sort of test of lowering the water, and we're able to do a wet dredge. So we've moved just over enough silt to fill Wembley Stadium and redistributed it around the park in areas, and then we'll in the future improve that land quality as well. So
so it's being recycled as sort of soil deposit, basically. How amazing. So what are the 3 things that you would hate a visitor arriving at Blenheim to miss when they go there? As your role of keeper of the collections, what are the 3 things that you wouldn't want anyone to miss seeing?
I would definitely recommend going and doing one of the private apartments tour and going to see Stubbs Tiger. The palace staterooms. I mean, we are so fortunate. They are just so beautiful, and now in such an amazing condition. I would really recommend everyone to go through there. And it's quite a contrast to the private apartments, so you can see the family living quarters are much smaller and more intimate, and the staterooms were built to entertain royalty.
Yeah.
So you get that feel when you're there. And
because how many staterooms are there at Blenheim again?
Only 11.
Okay. Only 11. I mean, that's,
I know
that's a lot.
But for some, in the whole scheme of things, for some houses, that's not huge.
Yeah,
but we do
true.
have the long library is the second longest room in a private house in the country.
Really? What's the first,
Castle Howard.
Is it?
Same architect,
That's
John Vanbrugh.
John
and he
Vanbrugh.
went slightly longer at Castle Howard.
Castle Howard was after Blenheim, was made after Blenheim. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. The library is, I think, one of my favourite rooms as well.
Beautiful.
At Blenheim. And also, what's the room that overlooks the land behind, the sort of the landscape behind? If you're coming in at the back of the palace, what's that amazing room?
The saloon?
Yeah, maybe the saloon.
Painted walls by Louis Laguerre.
Yes. That's my favourite.
Yeah, that's stunning.
Okay, so the staterooms, and then one other thing.
If I just had to pick one, I would definitely say our Churchill exhibition.
Okay, because
we're very much focused on Churchill's life at Blenheim, and so we've built the experience around that, but it gives you a really good insight into what his life was like. But looking at his writing, his painting, obviously Churchill was such a prolific artist, and we're fortunate to be able to display lots of his works at the palace.
Wow, that he gifted to the family.
Yes, and then we have loans from members of the family as well. So yeah, we've got a big collection now. We've also got one of his original travelling painting easels.
Wow.
But one of my favourite pieces in that exhibition is we have a diamond and malachite cigar box. Was gifted to Churchill from the people of the Belgian Congo as a thank you, but it's just the most exquisite thing.
Oh my gosh. And you can see all of that in the private tunnel. Wow, that's incredible. And then there is, I know because I've, again, been lucky enough to chat to you, but it would be so cool to just hear a little bit about what's being done at Blenheim to preserve it, because I know there's almost a whole department at Blenheim kind of looking at the preservation of its future, and it'd be really cool to just hear a little bit more about that, not just the collection, but anything else that you can share with us.
So it's something we as a business and as an estate have been focusing on for a number of years. 7 years ago, we put in 10 essential goals for the business. And one of the main ones was essentially spending up to £40 million on conservation and restoration of the palace and estate to make sure it's safeguarded for future generations. Fortunately, we're year 7, and next year we're going into probably our biggest project we've ever done. We need a new roof over the saloon Great Hall.
Wow.
And in the Great Hall, we have a beautiful ceiling by Sir James Thornhill. And in the saloon, we have a beautiful ceiling by Louis Laguerre. And years of leaking and structural issues have really started to degrade them. And these are both paintings of national importance, and they must be protected. So we're desperately trying to put every resource that we can into our roof project. It will mean 2 years of disruption. Wow. Unfortunately, £12.4 million. So at the moment, everything is going into that. But in the wider estate, we have a conservationist who looks after our bee population. He's discovered a new wild bee living in the Blenheim trees.
Wow.
But his aim is to educate and engage the public with the plight of the environment and the bees and try and protect them. We have obviously our oaks, which we are trying to look after for the future. We have beautiful cottages and a triumphal arch at Woodstock, and all of these things require a huge amount of time, money and protection. And our team, our very talented team, look after the day-to-day care of all of these things.
Amazing. It really is. It's a never ending kind of ongoing.
It's a bottomless pit. Unfortunately.
It really is. But I think people would be so surprised perhaps to know that it's still independently run. And so when, that kind of sum of money that's needed for those 2 rooms and the roof above them is something that has to be found independently. It's not something that, one can kind of, get from a sort of magic money tree. It's all of the visiting, it's all of the kind of filming that goes on there. It's that all presumably
all
goes towards.
Yes, all of the filming income goes back into conservation as well. And that's why it's so important to make it happen.
Yeah. So we've learned more about you and the history of Blenheim and the exciting things that are happening right now and all year round. But let's just move on to the future. I know, so you've been, the most exciting thing that we haven't yet come to is the icons of British fashion. And this has been your baby and your project at Blenheim. I'd love to just go right back to the beginning and where did the idea come from for the icons of British fashion, and just take us on that journey.
So I have always been a huge lover of fashion. I'm Australian, so obviously I didn't grow up in this country. And in 1988, I remember the Australian Wool Commission did a parade for the bicentennial where they invited various Australian designers, but then designers from the rest of the world to come to Australia and design a collection reflecting Australia using Australian wool.
I see.
Some of the designers that were invited were Kenzo, Claude Montana, Gianni Versace, Bruce Oldfield and Jean Muir.
Wow.
And I was obsessed with that when it first came out. I must have watched it 20 times, but my 2 favourite designers in the whole show were Bruce Oldfield and Jean Muir, and that had stuck in my head for years. Traditionally at the Palace, we've always done smaller historical exhibitions that have very strong links with our history. So it took a bit of convincing to change the thinking that we could do an exhibition that didn't have the usual very strong historical links with us and was far more modern. But I had a feeling, I mean, the V&A helps, obviously. They do these incredible exhibitions that sell out constantly.
It's so true.
And they do it so well. We obviously are different place. We're not a white box. We have to work within the confines of the Palace. But it was very important for me to bring these amazing British designers to an iconic British palace, but have the 2 work in conversation with each other. And so I started, just once I got permission to go ahead, I started a year ago, last March, and just wrote to all of the designers that I wanted, explained what the concept was and invited them to come to the Palace and see, and if they were willing to be part of it, to pick a room that they responded to, and then we could have a mixed approach of them curating the entire display to me curating the entire display and everything in between.
Right.
These are incredibly busy people and I didn't want to take up too much of their time, but I really wanted them to be involved as much as possible.
Yeah.
So fortunately they all came one by one and no one picked the same room. They all responded
That's very lucky.
I know, very, very lucky. They responded to completely different spaces, but they also responded in completely different ways.
That's interesting. In what sense?
Well, say, for example, Zandra Rhodes. She had actually visited the Palace in the early 1970s with Mick and Bianca Jagger.
Wow.
She dressed Bianca, that's just after they'd gotten married, and she had a memory of this incredibly glamorous night, a party in the Palace. So she wanted to recreate that memory in the room.
Wow. And was it a party with the family or with the...
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
How amazing. So she responded in particular to one room and...
Yes. And then, each one, say, Alice Templey came and she chose the second stateroom because she fell in love with the horses in the tapestries behind. But she walked in and immediately said it's not traditionally, it's a stateroom that would have been used for receiving guests on a small scale. And she said, can we put a dining table in here because I want to create a hedonistic Last Supper.
Wow. And
she has certainly done that. It is absolutely incredible.
Gosh. So there's 11 rooms that have been done by a different designer.
Yes, but then we've worked with Turnbull and Asser for Churchill.
Okay.
This year is the 150th anniversary of Churchill's birth.
Wow.
So we wanted to I always thought he was a bit of a fashion icon anyway.
Yeah. Something about his silhouette is just so iconic.
And the siren suit. I mean, he essentially
What is the siren suit?
It's a onesie.
Okay.
That Churchill had watched workmen at Chartwell in their boiler suits and thought, well, that's quite practical and comfortable. So went to Turnbull and Asser and said, I would like you to make me this, but make it in beautiful fabric. So they were made in green velvet, red velvet, and then became wool, pinstriped. And they were designed when the sirens went off during the war, he could pop something quickly over his pajamas or whatever he was wearing and get to work straight away.
I see. Gosh, that's amazing. And Turnbull and Asser were the creators for him.
Yes, they worked with him on creating it. And we have one of his original red ones in our collection, but they've also lent us their green one. Gosh. But then they designed his bow ties, his shirts, so we really wanted to collaborate with them on as part of the exhibition as well.
So they're the final sort of 12th room?
Yes, they're in the birth room that he was born, but then also they've got a small display in the Churchill exhibition.
Amazing. And some of the other some of the other designers that you chose to work with are who else?
Vivienne Westwood.
Iconic.
Yes. I mentioned before Jean Muir and the delightful Bruce Oldfield.
Really?
Oh, yes. He's amazing.
It sounds like he's one of your favourites.
Oh, he's so charming, and he's just wonderful. Terry de Havilland. So we made the bold decision to, in our china room, remove all of the china and put it in temporary storage, and the cabinets are filled with amazing shoes.
No.
Yes.
And that is quite a feat to remove china from a cabinet. I know.
Yeah.
But it makes sense if it's sort of part of the exhibition. But so, Kate, this is obviously an exhibition that is open to the public, I'm right in thinking?
Yes.
And when did it open again?
Opened on the 23rd of March.
Okay. And it closes on the
30th of June.
So quite soon.
Yes, sadly.
So people,
I wish it could go forever.
I bet, but people need to get themselves there if they haven't yet been. What have you taken from the show? You know, it was your idea, your sort of baby, as it were, to bring this to life. And I think it's so clever because it must have brought in such a younger audience as well.
That was the whole idea. We can't stay the same because if nothing ever changed, people wouldn't come back and visit because they would have seen it a number of times, and why would you continually go back to see the same thing? And I really wanted to open up historic houses to a different type of visitor. Fashion visitors might not generally visit historic houses, but if they come to see the fashion, I know they'll fall in love with what's there, and then hopefully they will be encouraged to visit more heritage properties.
Yeah, it's such a good point. And I think seeing fashion in those spaces, I'm, as I said to you off camera, Mike, but I haven't yet seen it myself, but I'm going to make sure I do before the end of June. But it also brings the rooms to life in a new way. I'm sure, having gone around Blenheim a few times, but I bet if I went in there and saw the exhibition when I do, I'm sure I'll spot things that I hadn't before, or it'll bring it all to life in a really vivid and different way.
Yes, it does. It really does. It has breathed new life into the rooms, and it does make you look at the palace in a different way.
How has it made, in what way for you?
I mean, we've done lots of things over the years, but this is an entirely new way of doing things. And we do contemporary art exhibitions every year. And that's always been interesting because it is a huge contrast with very contemporary art in a very historic setting. I've always believed it works, and it is every part of our collection is from different periods in history, and all of these things are just an extension of that. It's just an evolution of the palace and the collection, that new things keep to come in, but just makes you look at the whole experience in a completely different way.
Yeah. Blenheim really has led at the front, really, in terms of bringing in contemporary artists. But what would be your favourite previous kind of contemporary exhibition at Blenheim prior to the Icons of Fashion, which is your own? Ai Weiwei. Really? Yes. And just explain who that is and what the exhibition was.
So that was our first contemporary art exhibition with the Blenheim Art Foundation, and Ai Weiwei is a Chinese artist. At the time, he was sadly under house arrest in China, and for his political views, and he wasn't able to leave the country. So essentially, the whole installation had to be done via, video footage where
video calls.
we put everything in, and he would say yes, no, move thing.
Gosh.
Fortunately, he was only able even to visit 2 years ago, well after the exhibition, and he never got to see it in person there.
Wow.
But his work, I think, is just amazing and so powerful. He's a craftsman, and so therefore it sits beautifully with all of the other artists and craftsmen in the palace.
Yeah. And that was in what year that exhibition happened?
2014.
2014? Wow.
Yes.
That's a long time.
Yeah. There is still a lot of perception that you shouldn't mix contemporary with the historic, but that's something we're really working on, trying to bring people around to this new way of doing things.
Yeah, breaking down the barrier of that thinking. Because you're right, it brings younger people in. That's the most important thing, is getting young people into these spaces, because I think they have so much to offer beyond just the architecture and the art and the collections. It's just, they are the most refined and extraordinary spaces to be witnessing for oneself.
Absolutely. And to engage the younger generation in the amazing history of these places is so important.
I completely agree. It's so cool hearing about the icons of fashion, and I definitely promise. I mean, I almost sort
Please
of
do.
Now we've met. I almost kind of want to make sure that you're. I want to go around with
I'll
you.
give you a personal tour.
That would be so
Absolutely.
cool. But I really can't wait to just see, because also you've got Barber, which is one of my favourite sort of iconic wax jackets.
A country estate. The whole family have always worn Barber.
Yeah.
They have such an amazing heritage. I mean, been there since 1890. We have the oldest jacket in their archive, Uncle Harry's jacket from 1910 on display.
Who was Uncle Harry?
He was a wildlife photographer.
Okay.
And so they developed the oilcloth coat for him to be able to be out in all weathers but still be warm, dry and comfortable and look stylish.
I didn't know that. So that's what the wax jacket was originally.
Yes, originally fishermen.
Okay.
But then they evolved in 1910 to make it a little more stylish.
Okay, cool.
And now obviously they work with collaborations with Gucci and Ganni and many, many designers, so that the brand is always evolving.
Yeah.
So they have a scheme where you can bring your jacket back,
your Barber wax jacket,
and get it repaired or recycled, and they do 76,000 a year. Because obviously and that's one thing we wanted to address with the exhibition. Everyone's aware of the impact that the fashion industry has had on the environment.
Hugely, yeah.
And so we really wanted to address that with a number of designers, and Barber's a huge part of that, as is also the incredible Stella McCartney.
Yeah. Because everything, but so Barber re-wax old Barber jackets, and they did 76,000 last year.
There.
That's incredible,
isn't it?
Wow, and they are just. I think the grubbier they look, the better they look. Those Barber jackets.
They need to be lived in.
Yeah. But they're so synonymous with these kind of estates, and also the iconography and the imagery of these estates in the past. Particularly the photography, really. I've never seen a painted Barber jacket on someone necessarily, or in a kind of iconic painting, but I've seen plenty of pictures, obviously, of people wearing them over the.
We have a wall as part of the exhibition with a number of people
wearing them, famous people wearing them. That's very cool. So I guess the Icons of Fashion has been a huge project for you. What else is sort of coming up in the pipeline at Blenheim that you can share with us? I kind of feel bad even asking that question, given I can imagine how much work you've had on your plate getting this fashion exhibition to life.
No, we don't really. We don't have time to stop. You've got to keep going and keep pushing on to the next thing. So at the moment, I've just started working on, we're reopening an old space and returning it to the Victorian kitchen that it once was.
Wow.
It was changed into a commercial kitchen, I believe in the sort of 70s, 80s. And so we're in the process of stripping that back out and moving most of the original collection back into that space. So that should open by January next year, hopefully.
That's really exciting.
Yeah, really, really exciting.
So it was a Victorian installation, a Victorian kitchen that was put in?
Yes, it was. It was moved by the 9th Duke into that location.
I see. That's very cool. So that's the next big thing you're working on with your team. Wow. And what do you hope? Just, you've been there for 18 years. It doesn't sound like you're going to be going anywhere anytime soon. So what do you hope for the future of Blenheim Palace?
I hope that we keep protecting it, but keep evolving and keep having new generations visit and fall in love and experience these amazing heritage properties all over the UK. I mean, you are so spoiled, obviously being Australian. We don't have anything like this, so I'm in awe of the history and the heritage in this country, and I really, really hope that we continue to keep it fresh, keep it interesting, keep engaging people, but above all, protect it.
I agree. Because why do you think it's important that younger generations feel connected or get connected and inspired and visit these places? Why is that important in your mind?
I don't think you can look forward without looking back. It's so important to know where you've come from before you move forward. So, and obviously some of these things aren't taught so much in schools anymore. So people can come and be in the space and get that experience and that knowledge from actually visiting.
You're right. We're so lucky in this country to be just plot. If you look at a map, it's just full still of these incredible historic houses. And I'm, especially passionate about the ones that are still independent, because I think I just know firsthand.
There's not that many left.
There's not that many left, but it's taken just generation after generation of innovators, ideators, and forward thinking, buccaneer kind of future thinking custodians, and now teams that think on behalf of these buildings to ensure they survive. And I think
a lot of hard work.
A lot of hard work.
Thousands of people.
Yeah, particularly in Blenheim's case. I mean, Blenheim's estate office is probably one of my favourite modern buildings in an old setting I've ever been to.
The view is quite amazing.
The view is unbelievable. For our listeners, it's this unbelievable. I think the building is old in and of itself.
Yes.
Was it the old stables or something?
Yes, it was. Outside the gate.
Yeah, it's outside the sort of main gates in Woodstock, and it's got these glass sort of floor-to-ceiling glass windows. So you all sitting in the office and look directly at the palace, and I can only imagine the sunset behind the palace
beautiful.
It's stunning.
And you see all the wildlife running around the park.
Yeah.
Whenever I have meetings up there, I'm always like, I want to work up here, and they say, be quiet, you work in the palace.
Right. So you're actually based with your team in the palace itself.
Yes, we have a small, very unglamorous office behind the scenes.
But nevertheless, in the palace. So we're going to wrap up the conversation soon, Kate. But before we do, are there any other things in Blenheim or local to it that you'd recommend visitors to also enjoy and tag on to their visit to Blenheim?
Well, as we mentioned before, the village of Woodstock is just a beautiful little village. It's quite small, but it has a lot of independent galleries and shops and lovely restaurants and cafes, and you can walk. It's only a 5-minute walk from the palace. And so I definitely recommend wandering into Woodstock. Oxford is very close by as well. I couldn't, from a personal point of view, and if it's your thing, I would say definitely get to Bicester Village.
I was going to hazard a guess, given your love of fashion.
Yes, definitely worth a visit.
Because it's really close to Blenheim. It's sort of 10 minutes away. But it is the mecca of shopping outside of London, really. That's really cool. And if you could send a message to, the future sort of people in your position as the keeper of collections at Blenheim, what would that message be? That
sometimes it is worth all the hard work and the stress sometimes, and that there's always a way to do things, but sometimes you just have to look at it in a different way. So with things like filming, obviously people worry about the potential damage. These things can be done. You just have to do them a certain way and be very, very strict. And occasionally tell lots of people off, but it's worth the effort, and the end result is just so rewarding, knowing that the impact that you make on protecting these places for the future. And my final question, just because it piqued my interest, but you've obviously been on site, probably, telling Tom Cruise to get off the. But what are the? Do you have any stories for us about any of the sort of films that have been made at Blenheim? I'm sure there's only so much you can say, but I'd be so curious to know what's happened at Blenheim over the years with some of the filming. Yes, I mean, Tom Cruise was really lovely and very well behaved.
Really?
Yes. I remember once I told Alec Baldwin off because he sat on one of our chairs that had a do not sit sign on and something, but he said he hadn't realised.
Yeah.
And told him off. I've told a number of big actors to behave, because as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't matter whether they're a lighting technician or the lead actor or the director. Ridley Scott and I had some quite challenging conversations
about
during
Napoleon,
filming.
The
yes,
Napoleon.
That was a huge shoot.
Really? How long were they actually at Blenheim for filming?
It was a few weeks.
Wow. And you were on site every day making sure that they're keeping themselves in check.
Yes.
Wow.
And you have to have eyes everywhere. I mean, I have an amazing team who help. Because you just have to watch everything. When you've got 200 crew members in the palace, they sometimes forget that they're not in a studio and that they're in a really important place, and they just can't behave how they would normally behave in a studio. So
your eyes are being kept to make sure that sort of scaffolding doesn't go through a famous painting.
Yes, absolutely.
That's very
Tape's the biggest problem as well.
Interesting. Yeah. On what?
We have very strict guidelines which we send to all crews, but people stick tape everywhere, and the rule is no tape. And I don't want to hear low tack. It's no tape.
Yeah, because that damages painting.
Paintings, marble floors. Our stone, because it's limestone, it's quite
soft.
Fragile and soft. So if someone sticks tape on it, they'll take stone away with it. So we just can't risk any of that.
No, fair enough.
It's a challenge, but it's worth it.
Yeah, I bet it is. Oh, Kate, thank you so much. And I just take my hat off to you for putting the icons of fashion into play at Blenheim, because I really think the idea and what you've created with this exhibition, although I'm yet to see it, I've seen pictures and I will go and see it, but I think it's an example of what else can be done at historic houses. And hopefully it will inspire lots of other people at these historic houses to do similar or the same, because it does have such a fantastic impact on getting young people into these places, which is so important.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much for joining me
Please come and visit.
I will. I definitely will. I promise. Thank you.
Thank you.
So if you want to find out more about the work we're doing at Heritage X, book your visit to one of the UK's most historic destinations to learn about the history of one of these fantastic historic houses on our website. You can also find out more about Blenheim Palace by going to their website, www.blenheimpalace.com. Goodbye, and see you on the next one.